This episode is brought to you by Audible.com.
The leading provider of spoken audio information and entertainment.
That would be the Audible.com I was talking about. Audible has over 100,000 audiobooks available for you, and they want to give you one for free.
100,000? Ken, how is anybody supposed to choose?
John, it's a good thing I'm here. If there's one thing I know, it's that people can't get enough of Khan. Few warlords elicit the sounds of glee one hears when one hears the name Khan Noonien Singh. And now you can trace Khan's rise to power in Star Trek, The Eugenics Wars, The Rise and Fall of Khan Noonien Singh. Oh, spoiler alert, he also falls. That's a two-part story, but you can get one of those parts for free by giving Audible a try at audiblepodcast.com/missionlog.
If, on the other hand, you want a whole book, or a non-Star Trek book for whatever reason, dive into those 100,000 other titles we mentioned earlier. History, mystery, fantasy, science fiction, classics of yesteryear, or bestsellers of today. Download your title, load it onto your computer, smartphone, or MP3 player, and take it with you whenever and wherever you go.
We really do appreciate their support, and we hope you'll give Audible a try.
Get your free book today. audiblepodcast.com/missionlog.
Now entering Nerdist.com.
Mission Log, a Roddenberry Star Trek podcast, episode 46. A piece of the action.
Welcome into Mission Log, a Roddenberry Star Trek podcast. I'm Ken Ray, but you can call me Boss.
And I'm John Champion, and you can call me Boss.
Hey. There's going to be a turf war. Maybe after the show.
Each week, we examine an episode of Star Trek. You know, we're looking hard for the morals, messages, and meanings buried within.
This week, we're going to put a bag on you. We're putting you on ice. I'm taking this bum Tracy out of the headlines. I'm rubbing him out. Oh, I think I may have gotten another show in there. Sorry about that. Anyway, this week, we're giving you a piece of the action.
Ken, I don't think we would make very good gangsters.
I would make a lousy gangster. I would make a great Dick Tracy villain, which I think means that I would be perfectly at home in a piece of the action this week's episode that we're covering on the Mission Log.
True that, where Kirk and Spock and McCoy find themselves on a planet full of 1920s gangsters.
Yes.
1920s Chicago gangsters, no less.
Yeah, good point. That. How did they end up on another part of the galaxy? We'll get to that. But first, we'll do a little bit of trivia, and I am excited, John. This week, we got a new sponsor for trivia.
Oh, I'm so glad.
I know. Today's trivia with John Champion brought to you by Bang Bang, the makers of the sweetest little automatic in the world. John?
That thrills me to no end. Yes, so the trivia for this week. So it is well known that on the very first series proposal, as Gene Roddenberry was writing down the potential topics and potential storylines for the show, and these are all just like little one sentence or blurbs. They were kind of at the back of the book. He actually wrote the term President Capone. So that may have been an early idea for what turned into this episode. Now, a piece of the action was developed when it was kind of a response to the increased comedy of the show. So Trouble with the Tribbles had not aired yet, but it was shot about 7 episodes earlier than A Piece of the Action. And it's kind of well known that Gene L. Coon made the decision to push the comedy a little harder in Star Trek. And thus we get episodes like A Piece of the Action. Now, of course, there's the well-known, very funny scene in which Captain Kirk tries to confuse his captors with the card game Fizbin. And even after the number of times that I've watched it, I'm still confused on the rules. But it may entertain you, Ken, to know that there are actually rules written up to the game, the full game, if you wanted to play it. And at conventions, there have been card sets produced by which you could play Fizbin. And now the source of all knowledge on the internet, if you look up Fizbin on Urban Dictionary, it actually says that this is sort of like a secret handshake word that techies use. So like, Ken, if you were to call, say, AppleCare, if you needed support on your computer, rather than letting the guy on the other end of the line go through the whole long thing of like, well, I want you to turn the computer on. I want you to, you would just say Fizbin, and that would be the secret handshake so he knows that you know what you're doing. And then you just cut through all the other stuff and just go right to the tech speak.
You've got to be kidding me.
That's what it says. I'm going to try it out. I'm going to try it out next time I try to call for computer support.
Well, the problem is you just ruined it.
I ruined it for everybody?
Well, now everybody's just going to try that, and then they'll say, okay, so then you've obviously gone ahead into the prompt command, and you know, you're going to have people going, wait, okay, I'm sorry, I was kidding about the Fizbin thing.
And they're never going to use Fizbin again.
I know.
After that, yeah.
It's really interesting to me, actually, that you say that there are cards out there for it, because I found myself, and it's obvious that Kirk is just sitting there making the whole thing up, but I found myself wanting to play a game like that. Like, I would like to have a game that, you know, depending on the time of day you play it, and what season of the year it is, and what day of the week it is. I mean, the rules are different. We still know that we're playing... I don't like the name Fizbin. I would want to change it. Plus, that might actually confuse any tech support people who happen to be wondering.
Who would be playing the game with you.
Yeah, they would think, he needs help, but I can go ahead and jump to the part where I can actually help him. And I don't really need help. I just need well, let's see. It's a little bit after dark now, so I guess I need a fourth jack.
Don't be such a shrunk. There's a really cool thing about this episode. So, you know, we don't go into books, comics, all the other stuff out there, but there's an interesting tie-in here. When on Deep Space Nine, they were developing the storyline that then became More Troubles, More Tribbles, and they kind of did the crossover between the DS9 crew and the original series crew. Mm-hmm. One of the original ideas was actually not to do the Tribbles episode. It was to do a return to the planet where a piece of the action takes place. And I'm going to go back to Sigma Iosha 2 and follow up on that story. Well, that storyline didn't happen, obviously, so we got the Tribbles story instead. But Marvel Comics, they did a series called Marvel Star Trek Unlimited. They did a comic called A Piece of the Reaction, in which the TNG era Enterprise crew goes back to that planet. And guess what they find? They find that because of the communicator left behind, now that whole planet is sort of emulating 23rd century Starfleet.
That's kind of cool.
And there is an interesting commentary there about Star Trek fans taking on the imagery and the ideals of Starfleet and making it their own.
And all of that from the communicator?
All of that from the communicator and the experience with Kirk and Spock and McCoy.
Yeah, okay. There's that too. And the four people that Vic Tayback saw on the Enterprise. Speaking of which, I see here in your notes that you don't have that. It is really neat to see a Star Trek, I don't want to say villain, but a Star Trek heavy to whom I immediately want to yell, "Kiss my grits."
Well, of course, Vic Tayback, famous for playing Mel on Alice.
Yep.
I didn't put that in there, but I knew we would have to hit it at some point. If we didn't, I was just going to refer to him as Mel throughout the story synopsis.
Mel is actually, that's a great, and then he would say to you, well, from the grave, sadly, but he'd say, "Stow it, champion."
Right. Oh, by the way, I misspoke, and I apologize. I want to correct myself. The DS9 title is actually Trials and Tribulations. More Troubles, More Tribbles was something else that we will get to later.
More Troubles. I actually know that one. I know that one.
Yes?
Yeah.
Yes?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's in the animated series.
You're exactly right.
There you go.
Written by our good friend David Gerald. Another thing that we want to mention, the discovered document for this episode. We actually have the shooting schedule, the 6-day shooting schedule of this episode. And it's just kind of interesting to see the breakdown of how they shot it. So all the Enterprise interiors were done on the very last day. And we're talking about everything that takes place on the Enterprise. So the scenes with Kirk and Spock and McCoy, but also the scenes where they have already been on the planet and you just are dealing with Scotty and Uhura. And then those scenes were shot early in the day because, of course, as you go along in the production schedule, you have to allow time for overages so that the actors would then come in later. So if Shatner and Nimoy were working late on day 5, they would come in late on day 6 to shoot their scenes on the bridge. The planet interiors were all done at Desilu, right on the Star Trek stages that they had. And then right next door at Paramount were all the street exteriors, specifically used McFadden Street and Boston Street. And one other cool little piece of trivia, there's an Enterprise episode called Horizon that takes place on the horizon. And yes, the book, Chicago Mobs of the 20s, can be seen in one of the shots.
Once again, the Enterprise takes us hundreds of years into the future, to a place that seems to be decades and decades in our past. Set the Wayback Machine for a bright shining tomorrow.
Prologue. About 100 years ago, a ship called the Horizon had visited the planet Sigma Iosha II and was lost soon after her departure. Now, the Enterprise has come back for a visit, and Kirk radios the planet's boss, Mr. Bella Oxmix, to say that a landing party will be beaming down. Bella's a little confused, but he says someone will be on hand to meet them. Kirk, Spock, and McCoy sure are confused when they arrive to find that everything looks like Earth in the 1920s, and they are greeted by a couple of thugs holding Tommy guns. Act 1. The thugs confiscate Kirk's phaser, and they're on their way to see Oxmix, but not before a drive-by hit interrupts things. Seems to be all a part of the way things work here on Sigma Iosha 2 anyway. In fact, every person we can see is carrying a gun. I mean, packing heat. This is not the way the Horizon reported things on this planet. Time to meet the boss, Bella Oxmix. He's in charge of the biggest territory on the planet, and there seems to be a perpetual state of gangland warfare to expand territories. Kind of like when Krako's thugs just tried to hit Bella's men escorting the Enterprise crew. In Bella's office, Spock makes a discovery, a book called Chicago Mobs of the 20s, published in 1992. Bella says it's the one left behind by the Horizon. Spock sees it as the source of contamination in the days before there was a prime directive. You remember that thing that Kirk ignores all the time? The Ioshians are smart, but they are also highly imitative. They took it and they ran with it. Oxmix wants a deal. The Enterprise provides him with weapons so he can take over. If they don't do it, the landing party will be killed. Act 2. Kirk, Spock, and McCoy are being held hostage in a warehouse, and Oxmix has all their equipment. Kirk distracts the guards with an impossible card game, Fizbin, long enough to knock them out and take their weapons. They split up, but Kirk is almost immediately captured by one of the thugs working for rival gang boss Jojo Krako. Spock and McCoy fare a little better, though. They make it to a radio station where they can call the Enterprise and get beamed up. Inside Krako's HQ, Kirk tries to use reason. Let's all sit down and talk this over. It'll be better for the planet if there's unity and an end to the violence. The thought doesn't go over too well. Krako just wants weapons, but he offers to cut Kirk in on the deal. Kirk declines and ends up kidnapped again. On board the Enterprise, Spock takes a radio call from Oxmix, who is a little surprised to find him there, but nonetheless lets him know that Kirk has been captured. Spock agrees to negotiate if it will help bring back Kirk. Kirk, meanwhile, is doing his own thing, setting up a tripwire in the room where he's being held. He makes a hasty exit with a Tommy gun, and at that same moment, Spock and McCoy beam down into Bella's office, only to be greeted at the point of more guns. Of course. Act 3. Oxmix takes their weapons and has the advantage over Spock and McCoy. Really, they were that easy to dupe? At just the right moment, Kirk pushes his way through with a gun. Time to change tactics. Kirk and Spock take the very snazzy clothes of Bella's thugs, steal a car, and head off to find Krako. After using one of the locals, a 12-year-old kid, as a diversion, Kirk and Spock make their way into Krako's building, only to find themselves in the sights of more guns. Act 4. Right away, Krako is checking out these fancy heaters, phasers, and wants Kirk to bring him more. Kirk talks him into a private conversation, and at this point, he starts laying it on thick, putting the Federation in terms Krako will understand. Oh, and he also very slyly gets his phasers back. Kirk tells Krakow that the Federation is taking over. They'll put in a boss, and then they'll pull the strings. Krakow relents if it means he'll still have a position. Kirk radios Scotty and has him beam up Krakow to the Enterprise. They knock out Krakow's henchmen and now hightail it back to see Bella Oxmix. When the henchmen come to, they start to plan a hit on Oxmix. Kirk and Spock show up and give the same deal, the bluff about the Federation taking over, but they have Oxmix start calling the other bosses. Scotty then starts beaming each boss who's on the phone directly into Bella's office, including Krakow, who's back from his trip to the transporter room. It's total chaos. Kirk is trying to get the upper hand, but the bosses aren't buying it. Krakow's men show up and start shooting. Kirk calls Scotty and has the Enterprise blast the whole block with phasers set to stun. The bosses all back down now that they've seen the power the Federation brings. They all assume Kirk will be the boss now, but Kirk says he can't get involved in a small operation like theirs. Kirk nominates Oxmix to be the main boss with Krakow as his lieutenant. They agree to cut the Federation in for 40%, whatever that may mean. Back on the Enterprise, Spock is a little perplexed at what the Federation will actually do every year when a ship has to go back to collect its share. Kirk says all he wants is for that share to go into a planetary fund for education. McCoy has worse news. He left his communicator behind. The Iosians are very clever and highly adaptable. They'll copy its technology the same way they copied the Gangster book. In a few years, Kirk says the Iosians may turn things around and demand a piece of our action. The end.
Now, I assume as soon as you said the end, you stopped moving.
Yeah. Yes. Just like the show, I ended my read through in a freeze frame.
Good. I think you should. I think that's important. And honestly, it really saved a bit of embarrassment because the ending joke really wasn't that funny. I don't mean yours. No. I don't mean yours. Right. Well, I mean, yeah. when Kirk says, they might want a piece of our action. It's good that they did a freeze frame because otherwise you'd have to have Bones going, yeah.
Right. It's the only time in Star Trek that we end on a freeze frame.
Yeah, and it's very short.
Yeah, yeah.
It was a quick cut.
If it were only like real life and you tell a joke that doesn't go over well and you could just freeze frame and have credits appear right on top of you.
Yeah, wouldn't that be nice?
That would be great.
We might be wishing for more of those later this episode.
Right. Hey, Spock knows about a clutch.
Yeah, I know, right?
Yeah.
Kind of crazy.
That's a little weird. Yeah. See, here's the thing. Like, I liked all that writing. I liked their back and forth because they really are in their stride with the Kirk-Spock dynamic. But it just seemed to be another one of those unfortunate tropes where, okay, Spock knows everything. He can just sort of pull knowledge out of anywhere. A clutch? Really? They had 1931 Cadillac V12s on Vulcan that you just hop into and learn how to drive a stick shift.
I know we're not supposed to cross the timelines and all that stuff. And maybe it's because in the original series, Kirk didn't grow up with his uncle. He grew up with his mother and father.
I was thinking the same thing.
Yeah, I'm thinking about like him, like, taking that Corvette, over the side of whatever canyon that was, Bryce Canyon, the Grand Canyon, some horrible landfill canyon. But I mean, he's shifting gears and blowing the top off the thing. And then he gets in this 1920s, whatever. And he's like, I mean, Kirk knew that there was a starter separate from the key,
right? But
he didn't know about the clutch,
right?
And I'm thinking, hey, get that like 11-year-old Kirk.
Yeah,
he'll have this thing flying. Just you won't even need guns to kill people on the road.
No, well, Nero changed everything, but that is neither here nor there. Right?
Oh, Nero changes everything.
Yeah,
like he does.
I liked, though, when Spock finally gets to have some fun. And because they have a great exchange where Kirk's doing the check, right, but finally Spock clues in, and it's a nice bit where he does the line, I would advise you is to keep dialing, Oxmix.
Yep.
Because we haven't seen the Enforcer Spock in a long time, and I think he's really kind of embraced it again. He's standing there with a gun, and he gets to play gangster.
Yeah, but what really sells that line, as you said, is the use.
Yeah,
I would advise yous to keep dialing, Oxmix.
Right.
Yeah, it's kind of awesome. Yeah, a piece of the action reminds me of every bad comedian in the late 80s. And I'm not saying whether this is a bad episode. I'm saying it reminds me of every bad comedian in the late 80s and early 90s. Remember how everyone used to do Jack Nicholson as something? Imagine Jack Nicholson as a first grade teacher. I think it would go a little something like this. Or imagine Jack Nicholson as a traffic cop. I think it would be a little something like this. Imagine Jack Nicholson as the captain of the Enterprise. Right. I think it might go a little something like this. Okay. Yeah. So Star Trek gets like that, right? Yeah. Imagine Kirk and Spock in Prohibition times. Imagine the crew of the Enterprise in an episode of Scooby-Doo. Okay.
Oh, wait, we did that one.
We did that one, exactly. I mean, we're sort of starting to get that way. I know there are others that are going to be, what if it was like Kirk and Spock in Roman times? You know, I mean, and we're sort of doing that, which is cool. I mean, we've talked repeatedly about how this is an anthology show, so that is kind of a fun thing to do.
Right.
I mean, how many godlike races are you going to come across every now and then? It's neat to see them, bumble around with something that and it's almost like an accessibility thing again for the audience, right? They got transporters, they got warp drive, they got alien races. Oh, look at Smart Guy. He doesn't know about the clutch.
Yeah.
I mean, there's actually something kind of fun about seeing, somebody who's 300 years advanced and not be able to do something that most of the people sitting there watching it could do.
Yeah. Well, it's, like you just said, and we've said before on the show, how the original series was treated like an anthology where you could just pull out an episode, plug it in anywhere because you're hoping for reruns. And it's not like today where you've got shows like Lost where you have to watch it in order. The new Battlestar Galactica, you had to watch that in order. Yeah. And there are these long character arcs. TV was just simply not done like that at the time. But one of the things that I think that's cool here, and I've always said to people who maybe are not clued into Doctor Who, and I mean the newer Doctor Who, it's one of those shows where you do have some character arcs, you do have some payoff if you follow the show, but the format is so flexible. You can really do just about anything with it you want. You can do the comedy episode. You can do the horror episode. You can do the hard sci-fi episode. You can do romance. You can do all these different things, and they all kind of fit because you have such a big universe to play with. And, again, we're still talking about relatively early Star Trek. They have hit a stride here, and boy, they really just had magnificent episodes as you approach the end of season 1. There are just so many strong episodes there. But now it's kind of like they get to flex their creativity even more with the characters because the characters are established. And now they get to step outside of themselves a little bit.
No, I have to say, I love the fact that they give us a reason for an Earth-like planet here. I mean, we remember the absolute the torture that was Miri, because it's just like, hey, look, another Earth. Well, how do you think that happened? Well, don't worry about how we think that happened. Just get to the other parts. Right. So, I mean, to say, okay, we're going to put them in 1920s, and to say, well, how do we do that? Oh, well, here's how we do that. Okay, now I'm with you. Then by all means, let's fire up those heaters.
I wonder what would have happened if they left other books behind.
The Wizard of Oz. I would love it.
I was thinking of H.G. Wells' The Shape of Things to Come.
No? Oh, well, that's okay. Sure, if you want to be all
mainly because I love Art Deco. And if they had done anything that looked like the movie of Things to Come, then, that would have been a cool place to hang out for a while.
I'm sorry, Art who?
All right, yous, listen up. The boss and the boss are gonna start analyzing this week's Tales from Planet Gangland.
When I watched this episode, I took really just like 3 big notes, and those were the things that I thought would kick off our discussion. The first thing that I thought was kind of strange is, hey, aren't gangsters fun? Because you're in this period here, the mid-'60s, and you're doing popular entertainment. You're doing television for a mass audience. And I think about how, as a pop culture phenomenon, gangsters go from terrifying to cuddly and back to terrifying.
Yeah.
I think in the 20s, sure, there was some kind of weird, misplaced hero worship with the anti-heroes of people like Capone and John Dillinger and stuff like this. But these were dangerous people. And if you dealt with them, you ran a very high risk of getting killed. And then this sort of like popular entertainment version of gangsters came to be. And then you get into, I think, the kind of the renaissance of filmmaking in the 70s and going into the 80s and 90s, where you have serious looks again at gangsters. And even a movie that is kind of very pulpy, like The Untouchables, and as much of the clean-cut hero as Kevin Costner is as Elliot Ness. The version of Al Capone in that Robert De Niro plays, there is no question that he is a bad, dangerous person. And the way the violence plays out in that, because it's a Brian De Palma film, there's just no question about it. So it's kind of strange to go back and watch this thing where like the gangsters are cuddly. They're just sort of bumbling and fun, and we're just there to kind of shake things up. So that was the first thing that was strange.
It's not like you won't still see that happen. I mean, you can say the same thing sort of about Westerns as well, right? I mean, Westerns were cuddly for a long time, but you will have movies like, I mean, again, you've got very clean-cut characters in Tombstone, but there's something real going on in the movie Tombstone. Certainly, The Unforgiven. Yeah, absolutely. And so, but at the same time, you got stuff like Young Guns. We got the same thing going on with mobsters right now. I mean, within 2 or 3 years of each other, you had the Costas Mandylor, Christian Slater. I can't remember who else. Mobsters, right? And that's just like sheen and sexy. And, I honestly never saw it because I just couldn't even, fathom the idea. But somewhere within 2 or 3 years of that, I think about 2 or 3 years before that, actually, you had Goodfellas.
Yes.
Which is one of the most amazing movies, ever made. So, it is kind of weird. I think you're probably right to an extent. I mean, gangsters you've seen like harder treatments of gangsters, and then you get sort of the more cuddly around the 50s and 60s. I mean, I was reminded actually of Sheldon Leonard's character from It's a Wonderful Life. When we're dealing with the alt universe that George Bailey goes into. I mean, there's that kind of it's that accent. It's that, this guy's not really going to hurt you. He's not going to be your friend, but he's not going to hurt you. The Goodfellas guys would have just, put a bullet in Kirk's head.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
But it was a different time. It was a happier time.
Yeah. So you have to assume that big book from 1992, the Chicago Mobs of the 20s, had a heavy influence of Dick Tracy in there.
Exactly. Like I said earlier. Exactly. Now I do have to ask, is the big Bible-y book something that they made on this planet based on a much smaller, less reverential tome? Or did they have the big white, book about the gangsters of the 20s, on board the horizon? Because if they did, they had at least 2 of them, and one imagines they actually had 12 of them because there are 12 different bosses.
Well, so here's on that episode of Enterprise where we're on board the horizon, there is that big white book.
Seriously?
Chicago, yeah. So now you could infer that maybe they were carrying around a case of those just because they have to ship those all over the galaxy for some reason. Well, no, that's their job.
I will tell you exactly what happened. Third in command vanity pressed that thing. And brought it on board. He's like, "Oh, have you read my book?" Actually, I borrowed Captain Steubing's. I don't know who the captain of the Enterprise was, so I'll do the captain of the Love Boat instead. I borrowed Captain Steubing, so I'm really good. No, you hold on to that box. We might come across some people who will find that intensely interesting.
Yeah, can you just get it to me on Kindle, please? Because I don't have room because we're on a spaceship.
Right, I have
we need room for food.
I have the tiny little disc of it. Actually, I don't know what you're going to do with 13 of those.
Right. Yeah. My guess was that they had one book, and then the Iosians were clever enough that they reproduced it multiple times, and they passed this thing around because it is their Bible.
We're joking about that, but I'm honestly reminded of A Canticle for Leibowitz. I don't know if you remember. Did you ever read A Canticle for Leibowitz?
No, I don't know this. No.
It's been a long time since I've read it, and a lot of it, unfortunately, has escaped me. But we start off, and it's post-nuclear war Earth. We've gone very much into the Dark Ages, and we're actually now following a group of monks who are doing illuminated manuscripts. But they're not doing manuscripts; they're doing blueprints. And I don't remember now why it was that blueprints were what they did. But I mean, you have guys who will spend years working on one blueprint that they have found someplace else. So yeah, I kind of picture that with the gangsters of the 1920s, Chicago gangsters of the 1920s.
Well, speaking of blueprints, and this kind of is another thing that I thought of with this episode. Admiral Perry, his expedition to Japan in, I think it was 1853. So, just in a very, very small nutshell, Japan had existed for at least a couple hundred years under this feudal system with the shogun in charge. Mm-hmm. Okay. And then one day you have Admiral Perry show up with his Western ships and his Western crew and basically strong-arming them into saying, hey, look, you are going to open up trade with us because your society is the same as it was more than 200 years ago. We have ships, we have guns, we have all this other stuff, and you're going to adopt our governmental system. So then, by the time you get to the end of the 19th century and you get to the Meiji Restoration, suddenly Japan has a very Western look to it, a very Western culture. There are pockets where they've maintained traditions, but things change there very, very quickly. And one of the things that I read, this might be apocryphal, but one of the things that I had read is that after the ships had arrived and after these trade routes had started to open up, Westerners could actually go into Japanese shops and find things that had been sort of reverse engineered by the Japanese. We're talking about guns. We're talking, which did not exist in Japan, at least not in that same form up until this point. So they could go in there and find their own stuff that had immediately been adopted and recreated and reproduced by the Japanese. So I kind of thought about this as a very interesting parallel to that of just absorbing the technology right away, tearing it apart and rebuilding it and really changing the face of the entire culture because of that, how would Spock put it, contamination.
See, what I actually find fascinating about that, and I cannot believe this is the first we're talking about it, because you would think, and I will tell you the story of Admiral Perry is not one that I know, so I'm basing this entirely on what you just told me.
Okay. All right.
So basically what you're telling me is Admiral Perry shows up in Japan, takes a look around, turns to the ship's doctor and says, but look, they're not making anything. They're not doing anything. They're not evolving. I mean, how do we really? So we let Kirk go around and keep doing that with actually Earth history, Admiral Perry having done that?
Well, but here's the thing about Perry. Yeah, I think the more important thing about Perry, besides the fact that the Japanese, like I said, absorbed and then recreated all of this stuff that then was handed to them by the Westerners, the other kind of really interesting thing there is that, Perry went in for trade and basically intimidated the Japanese to say, well, look, the entire Western world is going to show up one day on your doorstep. So you better be ready for this. And they said, well, we don't really have a choice. So they did that. Now, good point. Yeah.
I'm still stuck on one thing, though. So he does that in like 1850.
Yeah.
In 1941, the Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor and are trying to take over, the half of the world that's not being overrun by the Nazis, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. So we actually now have to start worrying about the feeders of Vol.
Yes.
Because one day, having, torn asunder the way they did things and telling them, no, we do this, we do that, we call it freedom, and you're going to love it. And like 100 years from now, hey, who are those guys? And what are they doing?
Yeah.
Messing up my sunny day.
Watch out.
And my way of life and planet for,
right.
a few years at least.
Yeah.
I do have a question, though, about sort of how we deal with the Iosians. Mm-hmm. It's tough to say there's damage done by the Horizon because we don't know what the Iosians were like before, but we're going to assume that there was damage done. Contamination,
right?
As Spock says it. Kirk justifies his almost pathological need to meddle in any society they come across by saying, well, the Federation broke it. It is our duty to fix it.
Yeah.
Spock is still working to do this without blatant force or interference. but they're trying to fix interference that's already been done. And what's really weird to me is I don't know if he heard about it just since Spock, Bones, and Kirk landed on the planet, or if it was something that was kind of being worked on when the Horizon was there, but it wasn't completely, done when the Horizon was there. Even Krakow has heard of the Federation rules of non-interference. Mm-hmm. Now, how that word got around is kind of beyond me at the point that it comes in this episode. There are a few places that it took me. Once they decided, so how are we going to fix it? Well, we're going to fix it by leaving the guys here in charge.
Yeah, right.
Sort of like turning the thralls over to the gangsters of Triskelion and saying, hey, now you guys be good. Okay. This place needs a boss is what they say. So tell you what, big boss, who's not been able to maintain order to this point.
Right.
You be the boss. Now, second big boss, stick with me. You're going to be the second boss. Okay. And I'm sure everything is going to be fine this time. I mean, it strikes me as kind of crazy. I mean, the fact that Spock calls him out on it at the end kind of made me happy. But then we get the little kind of clarinet thing that basically is like the audio cue. That piece of music should be called "Here We Go Again." Yeah, because that's pretty much just what it is, right? Spock's like, "Hey, are we sure we did the right thing?" Boom, Yeah, it's like, yeah. Okay, well, fine. There was one other thing that I've been wondering about lately, and I'm gonna, anger people, I feel certain. I've been wondering lately what it is about the Prime Directive that I find personally so appealing. And I have to say, I don't think that it is actually the principle of non-interference that does it for me. I think what it really appeals to me about the Prime Directive, about the principle of non-interference, is that it's a code by which they live. And ideally, they live by it when it's easy to do. And we all live by things when they're easy to do. And they live by it when it's difficult, unless they happen to be Jim Kirk, in which case they live by it when they feel like it.
Sure, right.
There's a series of novels by a novelist called, it's either Ian or Ian, M. Banks. And they're called culture novels, and they're all really interesting novels. And life has evolved just a tremendous amount to the point that we can actually now bring other people up if they want to. We could land on a medieval planet and raise them to, within a generation, raise them into people who can actually change their bodies and change their metabolism and fly starships and understand things. And they're like living machines now that wander around, and they're not our robot servants. They're manufactured intelligence, kind of like we've talked about off and on throughout this series of podcasts that we've been doing. And I wonder, are we being a little sort of too standoffish to say, oh, no, let's let them do it on their own? Do you know what I mean? Because what happens in the culture novels, they'll come across a society and they'll say, so here's what we have to offer. Do you want it? Do you not? And if the society says, yeah, we want that, great. They start this process where they bring them into the culture, and then their uniqueness is folded into what goes on in the culture.
And if they say Borg,
well, kind of, except everybody still has what they came with. And then if the cultures, if the civilizations they come across says no, we don't want that, then they're like, okay, well, fine, have fun. We're going to be out here. And if you change your mind, let us know, because we'd love to have you. And if you don't want to, that's fine, too. And then you'll get like something where maybe a few members of the society will go ahead and join that. It's weird. I've sort of always clung to the idea of, I love the Prime Directive. But, if we see a war going on someplace, is it our duty to stop it? Or if we see a famine going on someplace, is it our duty to stop it? If we could, not to be all, Christian children's fun, but for the price of a cup of coffee, if we can actually, keep people from dying, do we do that? Should we do that? Or do we go, wow, that's really too bad. I wish there was something I could do, but I'm sort of, I got this thing where I don't do anything.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and just specifically in the case of a piece of the action, they left the planet with a bunch of criminals in charge. All they know right now is their criminal lives. And you have to wonder what tools they left with them. Only in just a few instances in Star Trek have we seen them leave a place or leave a culture with some help to get them beyond where they are? So even, and I think you're making a very good case here for justifying when we interfere and when we are morally obligated to do so. Certainly in the case where people are dying or being exploited or something like that. But it seems like, and it could just be the limitations of TV or a TV episode, and maybe not wanting to get too preachy by the end of it, but it seems like at the end, particularly with something like this, you have to say, well, okay, the Federation is going to leave behind this other thing to help you. We have a sociologist on board. We have social engineers on board. We have all these other tools that will help you to get out of this. And then, like you're saying, you also have to assume that there is a level of consent built into that, where you say to these people, is this okay with you? This is what we have to offer. But if you don't want it, we'll back off. It's a tough thing. Then you get into a whole other argument or conversation about, well, just by fact of being observed, you are then changing those who are being observed. You are changing the conditions of what you're observing by being there and observing them.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and maybe it's sort of a moot point because obviously the Prime Directive is the Prime Directive and the culture novels are something else different. If you want to see like a different way that's addressed. And as far as I know, there's not even a culture novel that really, that's about that. It's just sort of like you read 2 or 3 of these novels and you kind of pick up, oh, well, that's the way that goes. It's kind of an interesting.
Yeah.
It's not Star Trek-y at all, except that, we come across other societies and rather than saying, man, I hope they learn to fly, we say, hey, you guys want to go see something really cool? No?
Right,
all right.
Right.
Oh, you do? Come here. I want to show you this.
Well, and there's another, depending on how far you want to take this, there is something about the Prime Directive. Again, we're talking about the difference in pre-warp and post-warp societies. Mm-hmm. So the Prime Directive is saying, well, if they don't understand spacefaring, if they don't have warp technology, we're not going to go there. Now, the Horizon screwed that up in this episode, but that was before that rule was in place.
Right.
Okay, fine. But then by doing that, you do have to ask sort of bigger questions about how much of a culture are you influencing? How much of their original culture are you leaving intact? The world that we're presented with in Star Trek, when you look at the Federation as a whole, well, okay, you have all these different cultures. You've got humans, you have Andorians, you have Klingons. They all have Vulcans. They all have very well-defined senses of identity and senses of culture, but they also have these things that they share, at least enough common interest and particularly in the case of Star Trek, common technology that can bring them together. You have to wonder, depending on how much of this mental exercise you want to do, how much of that is achievable. That's why I brought up the Japanese and Admiral Perry. Well, once you start to disseminate your culture and your technology, how much of that original culture is still left,
Well, it may have to do with how far your culture advances too. I mean, if we're gonna keep playing this game that we're playing, I mean, at some point one would hope. The comedian Bill Hicks used to talk about it all the time. He wanted people to stop fighting so that we could hurry up, get smarter, and get off this rock. I mean, his idea was, in a very funny way, and then sadly a way that was taken away from us far too early. His idea was, if we can stop, hitting each other, then we could actually go out and do good things, like go, get off this rock. We could go do, other stuff. So, I mean, when you talk about things like, the Andorians and even the Klingons and the Vulcans and the humans, I mean, our society theoretically has evolved enough that we're like, all right, let's see what else.
I think this is really, really big picture stuff. This helps to define what the Federation is and how it operates and how much culture and technology sort of coincide but also conflict, The final kind of big note that I took on this episode was I thought that it was a very interesting and you might even say kind of ham-fisted look at zealotry and the religious zealotry with which the book is held. The book, in this case, the Gangster book, is the be-all and end-all for the Iosians. And they cannot even entertain the idea of any other form of life than what is given to them in the book. So there is a statement here about maybe having cultural or philosophical blinders on when it comes to the way you look at the world. It is interesting to me that Kirk uses their own, it takes him a little while, but he finally gets to that point where he learns to use their own culture and their own point of view to turn that back around on them. And you just kind of have to cross your fingers and hope for the best the next time a Federation ship lands there.
Bella Oxnix would be the first to tell you, if you want something in this world, you gotta take it. So, what did the mission log crew take from this week's show?
Time for that part of the show where we say, what are the messages, morals, and meanings of this episode, and does the episode stand the test of time? I want to do the does the episode stand the test of time part first.
Sure, yeah.
You can tell, or it would seem, that the memo that you mentioned a few shows back where people said they liked the interplay between Spock and McCoy, that's been taken very much to heart in this episode. We talked about sort of the comedy parts between Kirk and Spock, but there's a decent amount of that between Spock and McCoy as well. Not quite as funny as the thing we talked about a few weeks ago. I need your advice. Well, then I need a drink. Right. Not quite that, but there's a bit more interplay here. There's a lot of fun had in this episode. It's fun to see Nimoy play Spock as a bit less stoic than we normally do. I don't know that he'd actually have been as disrespectful to Kirk as he was at times, but it is fun to see Nimoy have fun, even if Spock is not having fun.
Yeah.
You talked about the fact that they used the 12-year-old kid as a diversion. The 12-year-old kid so worked for me, and he's on screen for maybe a minute and a half, except for the actual diversion. When he actually goes and daddy, that whole thing.
Yeah.
That did not work. But his conversation with Kirk, and more to the point, Shatner getting to play off a kid, was great. I mean, that worked out pretty well. Now, I will say, the next time you see Shatner anyplace, at a convention or just walking down the street, maybe in an interview, see if he's still got any of Bella Oxnix's couch cushions in the corner of his mouth, because, oh my God, was he chewing the scenery. I mean, it got, I don't want to say worse. I will say progressive. It progressed throughout the episode. It starts off and he's Captain Kirk. And then, he's a little bit of Captain Kirk. And by the end of it, I don't even know what accent he was doing.
Right.
I mean, it just gets so big and so huge and yet, I don't know. It didn't bother me.
Well, it's one of those moments you have to ask yourself, this is an actor decision or a director decision? Because in the reality of producing it, he could have just pulled this out from one of the many, many takes, and the director said, oh, that's really funny. Mm-hmm. Keep doing that, and it's not even thinking about the big picture of we're overplaying it or whatever. It just kind of worked for that moment. And then, sort of the positive reinforcement of, hey, look, what I'm doing is funny and people are really responding to it. So you keep pushing the envelope a bit.
Like a 3-year-old at a birthday party.
Right.
Or at a cocktail party.
Well, hey, why not? I will say that to me, very much like Gangsters of Triskelion, which we did last week, I kept thinking this episode should be terrible. It should be an awful episode, and it has no right to be as good as it is. Because when you talk about Star Trek to people, it's kind of like a piece of the action is one of those shorthand episodes. You're like, oh, yeah, remember when we went to the gangster planet? But you go back and watch it, and yeah, it's a cheesy premise, and it is totally played for camp. But despite itself, it really works. I don't think it works as well as Gangsters does, because you and I both really responded to that dark undercurrent that Gangsters had. But this one does work, even with all the comedy. There is that bit that they're all in on the joke. Everybody here is in on it, and that is a very tricky thing to pull off for any show without turning into Batman or turning into the third season of The Man from U.N.C.L.E., where it was this very conscious, like, hey, we're doing a comedy show now.
Yeah.
This, maybe it's because the characters are well defined and we love them already, and we're looking for those little hints of the things about the characters that we like. Mm-hmm. But somehow I swallowed this premise whole, and I went with it.
Well, I can tell you one of the reasons I think you might have is because it was fluffy. Which may sound crazy, but people chastised, I don't remember if it was us or me.
All of the above.
Okay, for not having fun with iMud, or just having fun with iMud. Yeah. And the reason it was difficult to do that with iMud is because it felt to me like there were actually real issues and bigger issues that were brought up in iMud. At least they were to me. Mm-hmm. And additionally, iMud was a waste of a really great character in Harry Mudd.
Yeah.
Now, this episode was much easier to just let go and have fun because there's not a lot of there in this episode. I mean, there are things you can fault, like why is a starship flying around with 12 copies of a 100-year-old book about, gangsters from Chicago, and not, say, a 400-year-old book about Sherwood Forest or a 150-year-old book about the Jazz Age or something like that, right? Mm-hmm. A whole library filled with all sorts of fanciful titles. And then you might end up with something like, a planet that's like Westworld or Future World.
Oh, yeah.
But who cares? Because that's not what happened. I mean, right. This show is what it is. And because, there's really not a lot. Unless, the blind adherence to the text to a religious extent, I guess, is actually something you could pick up. And I'm sort of ashamed that I missed it. But even then, we're not preaching that. It's not. And you can tell we're not preaching it because they let him go ahead and do it. They're not faulted for believing blindly in this book at the end. It's just they've been believing blindly in this book wrong. Oh, it's not going to work. It's Protestants and Catholics and Lutherans and Episcopalians. I tell you what, let's be Catholic. You be Pope. You be under Pope. That's pretty much what they did, right? They pretty much set up like a Pope and a college of bishops.
Yeah.
And said, this is how this is going to work from now on. And we're going to leave and we're going to come back. And hopefully you guys aren't doing drive-bys when we return.
Well, but I have to hope. This is sort of an interesting thing is to say that, they left the structure in place. But it was that blind adherence to the book that is the problem. I hope that the point of view, at least, of the Federation, or wherever it comes back, or wherever is helping the Iosians to go beyond that, are going towards something that would allow the Iosians to think for themselves and not merely imitate what they are handed. It's sort of this idea of, I don't want to teach you what to think, I want to teach you how to think. And I hope that's the point of view here, if you were to extrapolate the next episode, the next time we come back to the Iosians. I know I mentioned what happens in the comic book, which is a lot of fun, but the comic book assumes that the Iosians stay true to nature and they only imitate what they are handed. Rod and I kind of had this conversation, and he left us a note about how they could have made a stronger statement about how absurd it is for a society to unquestionably follow a book, and whether or not you're going to make this into a religious story. And they sort of threw it out there, but that wasn't truly what the episode was about. So I think it's interesting that we get to have that conversation and say, well, maybe if we were to put on our producer hats and come up with what the next episode would be to follow the Iosians, well, maybe they've been taught a little something about the methodology of thinking for themselves and not just copying what they're handed. Because God knows there's a lot of books out there. And they might get another very bad book to base a society on.
I keep trying to think of what's like a terrible book that they could have done that with, but...
just all the Jacqueline Suzanne novels. They're just going to get all of that, and it'll just be rampant. It'll just be a mess. They never get anything done.
You see, here's the problem. I feel fairly certain you've offended somebody, but
Okay, I take that back.
I don't know who though, so I guess we're okay. Right. And because here's the other thing. We aren't trying to tell you what to think or how to think. I will say though, we would love to hear what you do think. So if you'd like to get in touch with us. There are certainly a few ways to do that. Facebook, Skype, Twitter, The handle is Mission Log Pod. If you do one of those things, you can also just pick up the phone and call us, or pick up a phone and call us, since there tends to be more than one. 323-522-5641 is the number to call. 323-522-5641. You can email us, missionlog@roddenberry.com. That email address again is missionlog@roddenberry.com. And don't forget to check out our very nice home on the internet, missionlogpodcast.com. Remember, we may use your comments on an upcoming episode of Mission Log.
Well, it's been a pleasure as always, Ken. And next week, make sure you tune in for the Immunity Syndrome.
Some of the music for the Mission Log provided by Warp 11, online at warp11.com, and from the album Messages by Key Theory, free to download at kitheory.com. It's like the tough guys of old would say, if they bring a shuttle, you bring a starship. If they bring a Tommy gun, you bring a phaser. Here endeth the transmission.
Now leaving Nerdist.com.